Hi, my name is Dave, and I'm a product manager for Android Vitals. Today, I'm excited to be talking to you about the new frame rate metrics for games in Android Vitals. Frame rates are an important metric for games. They convey how smooth and fluid a game feels for users, and users engage more with games that feel responsive. This can lead directly to business success. In Vitals, we want to make sure that you have access to the data that you need in order to deliver great feeling experiences for your users. In this talk, we'll cover the new Vitals metric and go into details on how it's measured and how we look across sessions to build a picture of performance. We'll discuss how Play uses this new metric, suggestions for how you can use it, and we'll wrap up by talking about the roadmap for frame rate metrics. Android Vitals has reported on frame rate metrics for years, but these metrics only show rates for frames rendered using the Android UI toolkit. If you go to the Vitals overview today, you'll see a section called Android UI Toolkit with metrics for slow frames and frozen frames, with an explanation of the scope. Given that games typically use OpenGL or Vulkan, I expect most of you have not found these metrics relevant and have needed to invest in your own solutions for monitoring this critical metric. Some of you may recall that we launched an SDK-powered solution for frame rate metrics back in 2020 called Android Performance Tuner. We have a large number of titles using it. But we recognize that implementing an SDK requires effort and may not be feasible for all of you. So I'm pleased to tell you that, as a result of advances in the Android platform over time, we're now able to offer an SDK-free frame rate solution for game developers within Android Vitals. This allows you to monitor frame rate metrics with no upfront investment, although it's complementary to Android Performance Tuner, which we'll talk about more later. The first frame rate metric for games we're introducing is called slow session rate. We wanted to include a metric for frame rates, but rather than just reporting frame rate, which is included, we wanted the metric to be opinionated about the user experience. And we wanted to make you, the developer, aware of problematic experiences affecting your users, so you can fix them and improve your user's experience in your game. So we have slow session rate. A slow session is one in which too many of the frames are rendered slowly, that is, slower than a target frame rate. Let's dive into some details. I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. First, how we measure frame rate. Second, how we define a slow session. And finally, how we calculate your game's slow session rate. Let's start with how we measure frame rate. We use Surface Flinger, Android's compositor, to measure the timing of each frame your game renders. Surface Flinger measures present-to-present time of all frames, regardless of whether they are rendered with OpenGL, Vulkan, or even Android UI Toolkit. Surface Flinger has existed for many years, so we are able to provide frame rate metrics for devices running Android 9 or later. This is over 75% coverage, so you should get a good representation of your user population, which may have a different makeup of Android versions. During a session, Android Vitals measures the frame rate of all frames, and we keep track of how fast they are rendered. Now, let's talk about how we define a slow session. Many of you probably know this already, but just as a reminder, the key to understanding any frame rate metric is to remember that each frame in a session can render at a different frame rate. So, we tabulate the frame rates over the course of a session, and then we apply a threshold. During the course of the session, many things happen besides the game loop. There's the startup sequence, starting the game, looking at menus. Sometimes you may lower the frame rate intentionally, or it may dip during a gameplay during a particularly complex scene. In short, there are good reasons for a game to run slower than a target sometimes. We took this into account when creating the definition of a slow session. Now, you're probably thinking, what is the target frame rate? We have set the target frame rate at 30 frames per second. When setting this threshold, we consider the fact that there are many types of games available on Play, from puzzles to racing games. At 30 frames per second, we can be confident that users are having a reasonable experience regardless of what type of game they're playing. Now, it's also fair to say that in certain cases, many users may not consider 30 frames per second to be enough, with many gamers appreciating 60 frames per second, especially on higher-end phones. So think of 30 FPS as a minimum that we'd like you to aim for, not necessarily the ideal. At the same time, we've already acknowledged that there may be good reasons to render frames below 30 frames per second at times, and we realize that even unintentional variation can be hard to avoid completely. So we have defined a slow session as one where more than 25% of frames are rendered slower than the target frame rate of 30 frames per second. This means we allow for up to 25% of your frames in a session to miss the 30 FPS threshold before we consider it to be slow, which gives us some leeway for menus, loading screens, and the like. So, if 35% of frames are rendered slower than target, the session is considered slow. If 23% of frames are rendered slower than the target frame rate, the session is not slow. This means you don't have to try to hit the target with every frame. Work to ensure your game loop is running smoothly at the target rate, and you should be fine. You may also find that users want to play your game on lower performing devices and are accepting of the trade-offs with battery, heat, and performance. We're going to set a lower bar than 30 frames per second, at which we consider the user experience to be so poor that we ultimately would want to see your user away from this game experience. This bar is 20 frames per second. Again, we recognize that dropping frame rate is often desired even on action games, and for some casual games, users can tolerate slower frames in the core loop. But even in these scenarios, we still expect the game to be able to achieve at least 75% of frames at 20 frames per second. So the 30 frames per second target will tell you how many of your users are falling short of having a good experience, and the 20 frames per second target tells you how many users are very likely to be having a poor experience. So now we've talked about how we measure frame rates and how we determine if a particular session is slow. In order to get slow session rate, we then look at all of your sessions and calculate what fraction of sessions are slow. We evaluate slow session rate separately for the 30 frames per second and 20 frames per second targets. As with other vitals metrics like user perceived crash and ANR rate, you can use filters and breakdown tables to explore your slow session rate performance and investigate how it varies across various dimensions, such as device model or Android version. We'll discuss this more shortly, but slow session rate varies meaningfully by device model, and this is something you should become familiar with. I started out by saying that frame rate is a key measure of user experience on games and plays a big role in a user's ability to be immersed in your game. Its importance to users is the reason why we've invested in supporting it more in Vitals by bringing a no investment required solution to all of our developers. This is also why, in due course, the slow sessions metric at the minimum 20 frames per second target is going to become part of Play's quality bar, alongside user perceived crash rate and user perceived ANR rate for games specifically. What this means is that slow sessions will have a per device bad behavior threshold, similar to user perceived crash and ANR rates. And when your title exceeds the bad behavior threshold for a given phone model, like, for example, a Pixel 3, then Google Play may reduce the discoverability of your title for users on that phone model. This means it may become ineligible for some discovery surfaces, and in certain cases, we may show a warning on your store listing to indicate to users that your game may not perform well on their phone. Just to be clear, we are not planning to launch an overall bad behavior threshold for slow sessions at this point. So if frame rate is an issue on certain phones, the consequences will be limited to users on those phones and not applied at the app level. And again, while 30 frames per second is in general the minimum that we would recommend for a reasonable experience, Play will not actively steer users away from your game unless it is actually failing to achieve even 20 frames per second on their specific device. For example, if your slow session rate at 20 frames per second on phone A is above the bad behavior threshold, but your slow session rate at 20 frames per second on phone B is below the bad behavior threshold, then your game may have reduced discoverability in the store if a user has phone A, but there will be no impact to your game for users who have phone B. We understand that it takes time to get used to new metrics. Even if you've been monitoring your frame rate outside vitals, there can be differences in measurement methodologies. And so you will have at least a couple of months before we confirm the launch date for the bad behavior threshold, as well as what value it will be set at. Now, you may be thinking, okay, so now that you've introduced this metric, what should I do with it? We would love to see more users experience 30 frames per second or higher gaming. You can use the slow sessions metric to find out which devices are running smoothly at 30 frames per second and which need a bit of work. Issues with frame rate can be device specific or can be down to certain areas of the game. To get more granularity, especially about which parts of the game have slower or higher frame rates, we recommend using Android Performance Tuner. Android Performance Tuner allows you to annotate parts of your game so you can find out which parts are slower, allowing you to optimize them and improve the frame rate. We now have a Unity plugin for Android Performance Tuner, making it even easier to integrate and use. It is used by a large number of developers, and you can find out more about how it can help you by following the on-screen link. And for further and deeper analysis, you can also use the Android GPU Inspector or Perfetto. The slow session rate metric in Android Vitals will allow you to stay on top of your slow session metric with time series and histograms so you can understand your game's performance. There are breakdowns to help you zero in on problems, and as with other Vitals metrics, you can see context about each device without leaving the page, such as ratings and reviews and install base. This can help you evaluate the impact of arising or existing problems. To learn even more about ideals for tools and libraries you can use to improve frame rate performance, you should check out the talks about Android Game Developer Kit, which you can find at the main hub page. I mentioned that one of the upcoming changes will be to include slow sessions in the new per-device quality bar. In addition, we're looking to extend our reporting to cover frame rate variability. Fast, smooth, and stable frame rates make games feel great to gamers. Slow session rate focuses on the fast part of the experience. Another very meaningful part is smooth and stable. Low stability, or high variability in the frame rate between frames, can make a game that isn't slow feel jittery or janky to players. Conversely, a game with lower frame rate but very good stability can still feel really good to players. Vitals will, in the future, create a new metric for frame rate stability. For now, you should start measuring frame rate stability so that your game is already smooth and stable across a broad range of devices when the new Vitals metric is complete. To improve frame stability, we recommend that you use the Android Frame Pacing API. You can get it as part of the Android Game Development Kit, or if you're using Unity, Cocos, or Unreal, you can turn it on in the settings. It's been a pleasure to introduce the new slow sessions rate metric to you. We've talked through how we measure slow session rate and discussed the 30 frames per second target rate and the 20 frames per second minimum rate, which is where the bad behavior threshold will be in due course. We discussed how you can use the slow session rate data to help you improve your frame rate, and you can even use Android Performance Tuner to get finer grain information and pinpoint slowdowns. We hope this new metric gives you visibility into frame rate performance of your game and makes it easier for you to create smooth experiences for your players. Thanks for watching.